You're watching the History Fire channel. In this video we're looking at the Battle of Fort Donelson, Part 2. On February the 12th, most of the Union troops departed Fort Henry, where they were waiting for the return of Union gunboats and the arrival of additional troops that would increase the Union forces to around 25,000 men. The Union forces proceeded about 5 miles on the two main roads leading between the two forts. They were delayed most of the day by a cavalry screen commanded by Nathan Bedford Forrest. Forrest's troops, sent up by Buckner, spotted a detachment from McClellan's division and opened fire against them. A brief skirmish ensued until orders from Buckner arrived to fall back within the entrenchments. After this withdrawal of Forrest's cavalry, the Union troops moved closer to the Confederate defensive line, while trying to cover any possible Confederate escape routes. McClellan's division made up the right of Grant's army, with C.F. Smith's division forming the left. USS Carondelet was the first gunboat to arrive up the river, and she promptly fired numerous shells into the fort, testing its defences before retiring. Grant arrived on February the 12th and established his headquarters near the left side of the front of the line at Widow Crisp's house. On February the 11th, Buckner relayed orders to Pillow from Floyd to release Floyd's and Buckner's troops to operate south of the river near Cumberland City, where they would be able to attack the Union supply lines while keeping a clear path back to Nashville. However, this would leave the Confederate forces at Fort Donelson heavily outnumbered. General Pillow left early on the morning of February the 12th to argue these orders with General Floyd himself, leaving Buckner in charge of the fort. After hearing sounds of artillery fire, Pillow returned to Fort Donelson to resume command. After the events of the day, Buckner remained at Fort Donelson to command the Confederate right. With the arrival of Grant's army, General Johnston ordered Floyd to take any troops remaining in Clarksville to aid in the defense of Fort Donelson. On February the 13th, several small probing attacks were carried out against the Confederate defences, essentially ignoring orders from Grant that no general engagement be provoked. On the Union left, C.F. Smith sent two of his 4 brigades under Colonels Jacob Lauman and John Cook to test the defences along his front. The attack suffered light casualties and made no gains, but Smith was able to keep up a harassing fire throughout the night. On the right, McClellan, who had ordered the unauthorized attack, 2 regiments of Colonel William R. Morrison's brigade, along with 1 regiment, the 48th Illinois, from Colonel W. H. L. Wallace's brigade. These were ordered to seize a battery that had been plaguing their position. Isham Hayne, colonel of the 48th Illinois, was senior in rank to Colonel Morrison. Although rightfully in command of 2 of the 3 regiments, Morrison volunteered to turn over command once the attack was underway. However, when the attack began, Morrison was wounded, eliminating any leadership ambiguity. For unknown reasons, Hayne never fully took control, and the attack was repulsed. Some wounded men caught between the lines burned to death in crossfires, ignited by the artillery. General Grant had Commander Henry Walk up the Carondelet, up the Cumberland River, to create a diversion by opening fire on the fort. The Confederates responded with shots from their long-range guns and eventually hit the gunboat. Walk retreated several miles below the fort, but soon returned and continued shelling the water batteries. General McClellan, in the meantime, had been attempting to stretch his men towards the river but ran into difficulties with a Confederate battery of guns. McClellan ultimately decided that he did not have enough men to stretch all the way to the river, so Grant decided to call on more troops. He sent orders to General Wallace, who had been left behind at Fort Henry, to bring his men to Fort Donelson. With Floyd's arrival to take command of Fort Donelson, Pillow took over leading the Confederate left. Feeling overwhelmed, Floyd left most of the actual command to Pillow and Buckner. At the end of the day, there had been several skirmishes, but the positions of each side were essentially the same. The night progressed with both sides fighting the cold weather. Although the weather had been mostly rainy up to this point in the campaign, a snowstorm arrived the night of February the 13th, with strong winds that brought temperatures down to 10 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit, and deposited 3 inches of snow by morning. Guns and wagons were frozen to the earth. Because of proximity of the enemy lines and the active sharpshooters, the soldiers could not light campfires for warmth or cooking, and both sides were miserable by that night, many having arrived without blankets or overcoats. At 11 a.m. on February the 14th, Floyd held a council of war in his headquarters at Dover Hotel. There was general agreement that Fort Donelson was probably untenable. General Pillow was designated to lead a breakout attempt, evacuate the fort, and march to Nashville. Troops were moved behind the lines and the assault readied, and they broke through Union lines, but Grant sent them back to Fort Donelson reeling. Pillow, normally quite aggressive in battle, was unnerved and announced that since their movement had been detected, the breakout was sent back. On February the 14th, General Lew Wallace's brigade arrived from Fort Henry around noon. Foote's flotilla arrived on the Cumberland River mid-afternoon, bringing 6 gunboats and another 10,000 Union reinforcements on 12 transport ships. Wallace assembled these new troops into a 3rd division of 2 brigades, under Colonels John M. Thayer and Charles Cruft, and occupied the centre of the line facing the Confederate trenches. This provided sufficient troops to extend McClellan's right flank to be anchored on Lick Creek. By moving Colonel John MacArthur's brigade of Smith's division from the reserve to a position from which they intended to plug the 400 yards gap at dawn the next morning. As soon as Foote arrived, Grant urged him to attack the fort's river batteries. Although Foote was reluctant to proceed before adequate reconnaissance, he moved his gunboats close to the shore by 3 p.m. and opened fire just as he had done at Fort Henry. Confederate gunners waited until the gunboats were within 400 yards to return fire. The Confederate artillery pummeled the fleet with heavy gunfire, and the assault was over by 4:30. Foote was wounded, coincidentally in his foot. The wheelhouse of his flagship, USS St. Louis, was carried away and she floated helplessly downriver. USS Louisville was also disabled, and Pittsburgh began to take on water. The damage to the fleet was significant, and it retreated downriver. Of the 500 shots fired, St. Louis was hit 59 times, Carondelet 54, Louisville 36, and Pittsburgh 20 times. Foote had miscalculated the assault. Historian Kendall Gott suggested that he would have been more prudent to stay as far downriver as possible and use the fleet's longer range guns to reduce the fort. An alternative might have been to overrun the batteries, probably at night, as would be done successfully in the 1863 Vicksburg campaign. Once the Union fleet was past the fixed river batteries, Fort Donelson would have been defenseless. 8 Union sailors were killed and 44 were wounded, while the Confederates lost none. Captain Joseph Dixon of the river batteries had been killed the previous day during the Carondelet bombardment. On land, the well-armed Union soldiers surrounded the Confederates, while the Union boats, although damaged, still controlled the river. Grant realized that any success at Fort Donelson would have been carried by the army without strong naval support, and he warned Halleck that he might have to resort to a siege. Despite their unexpected naval success, the Confederate generals were still skeptical about their chances in the fort and held another late-night council of war, where they decided to retry their reported escape plan. At dawn on February the 15th, the Confederates launched an assault led by Pillow against McClellan's division on the unprotected right flank of the Union line. The Union troops, unable to sleep in the cold weather, were not caught entirely by surprise, but Grant was. Not expecting a land assault from the Confederates, he was up before dawn and had headed off to visit Flag Officer Foote on his flagship downriver. Grant left orders that none of his generals were to initiate any engagement, and no one was designated as second in command during his absence. The Confederate plan was for Pillow to push McClellan away, take control of Wynn's Ferry and Forge Roads, the main routes to Nashville. Buckner was to move his divisions across Wynn Ferry's road and act as a rear guard for the remainder of the army, as it withdrew from Fort Donelson and moved east. A lone regiment from Buckner's division, the 30th Tennessee, was designated to stay in the trenches and prevent a Federal pursuit. The attack started well, and after 2 hours of heavy fighting, Pillow's men pushed McClellan's line back and opened the escape route. It was in this attack that Union troops in the west first heard the famous, unnerving rebel yell. The attack was initially successful because of the inexperience and poor positioning of McClellan's troops and a flanking attack from the Confederate cavalry under Forrest. The Union brigades of Colonels Richard Oglesby and John MacArthur were hit hardest, where they withdrew in a generally orderly manner to the rear for regrouping and resupply. Around 8 a.m. McClellan sent a message requesting assistance from Lew Wallace, but Wallace had no orders from Grant, who was still absent, to respond to attack on a fellow officer and declined the initial request. Wallace, who was hesitant to disobey orders, sent an aide to Grant's headquarters for further instructions. In the meantime, McClellan's ammunition was running out, but his withdrawal was not yet a rout. A second messenger arrived at Wallace's camp in tears, crying, "Our right flank is turned. The whole army is in danger." This time Wallace sent a brigade under Colonel Charles Cruft to aid McClellan. Cruft's brigade was sent in to replace Oglesby's and MacArthur's brigades, but when they realized they had run into Pillow's Confederates and were being flanked, they too began to fall back. Not everything was going well with the Confederate advance. By 9:30 a.m., as the lead Union brigades were falling back, Nathan Bedford Forrest urged Bushrod Johnson to launch an all-out attack on the disorganized troops. Johnson was too cautious to approve a general assault, but he did agree to keep the infantry moving slowly forward. 2 hours into the battle, General Pillow realized that Buckner's wing was not attacking alongside him. After a confrontation between the two generals, Buckner's troops moved out and, combined with the right flank of Pillow's wing, hit W.H.L. Wallace's brigade. The Confederates took control of Forge Road and a key section of Wynn's Ferry Road, opening a route to Nashville. But Buckner's delay provided time for Lew Wallace's men to reinforce McClellan's retreating forces before they were completely routed. Despite Grant's earlier orders, Wallace's units moved to the right with Thayer's brigade, giving McClellan's men time to regroup and gather ammunition from Wallace's supplies. The 68th Ohio was left behind to protect the rear. The Confederate offensive ended around 12:30 when Wallace's and Thayer's Union troops formed a defensive line on a ridge astride Wynn's Ferry Road. The Confederates assaulted them 3 times, but were unsuccessful and withdrew to a ridge half a mile away. Nevertheless, they had a good morning. The Confederates had pushed the Union defenders back 1 to 2 miles and had opened their escape route. Grant, who was apparently unaware of the battle, was notified by an aide and returned to his troops in the early afternoon. Grant first visited C.F. Smith's troops on the Union left, where Grant ordered the 8th Missouri and the 11th Indiana to the Union right, then rode 7 miles over icy roads to find McClellan's and Wallace. Grant was dismayed at the confusion and the lack of organized leadership. McClellan grumbled, "This army wants a head." Grant replied, "It seems so, gentlemen. The position on the right must be retaken." True to his nature, Grant did not panic at the Confederate assault. As Grant rode back from the river, he heard the sounds of guns and sent word afoot to begin a demonstration of naval gunfire. Assuming that his troops would be demoralized and could use the encouragement, Grant observed that some of the Confederates were fighting with knapsacks filled with 3 days' ration, which implied to him that they were attempting to escape, not pressing for a combat victory. He told an aide, "The one who attacks first now will be victorious. The enemy will have to be in a hurry if he gets ahead of me." Despite the successful morning attack, access to the open escape route, and to the amazement of Floyd and Buckner, Pillow ordered his men back to the trenches by 1:30. Buckner confronted Pillow, and Floyd intended to countermand the order, but Pillow argued that his men needed to regroup and resupply before evacuating the fort. Pillow won the argument. Floyd also believed that C.F. Smith's division was being heavily reinforced, so the entire Confederate force was ordered back inside the lines of Fort Donelson, giving up the ground they gained earlier that day. Grant moved quickly to exploit the opening and told Smith, "All has failed on our right. You must take Fort Donelson." Smith replied, "I will do it." Smith formed his 2 remaining brigades to make an attack. Lauman's brigade would be the main attack, spearheaded by Colonel James Tuttle's 2nd Iowa Infantry. Cook's brigade would be in support to the right and rear and act as a feint to draw fire away from Lauman's brigade. Smith's 2 brigades attack quickly seized the outer line of entrenchments on the Confederate right from the 30th Tennessee, commanded by Colonel W. Head, who had been left behind from Buckner's division. Despite 2 hours of repeated counterattacks, the Confederates could not repel Smith from the captured earthworks. The Union was now poised to seize Fort Donelson and its river batteries when light returned the next morning. In the meantime, on the Union right, Lew Wallace formed an attacking column with 3 brigades, one from his own division, one from McClellan's, and one from Smith's, to try and regain control of ground lost in the battle that morning. Wallace's old brigade of Zouaves, the 11th Indiana and 8th Missouri, now commanded by Colonel Morgan L. Smith, and others from McClellan's and Wallace's divisions, were chosen to lead the attack. The brigade of Cruft, Wallace's division, and Leonard F. Ross, McClellan's division, were placed in support on the flanks. Wallace ordered the attack forward, and Smith, the 8th Missouri, and the 11th Indiana advanced a short distance up the hill, using the Zouaves tactics, where the men repeatedly rushed and then fell to the ground in a prone position. By 5:30, Wallace's troops had succeeded in retaking the ground lost that morning, and by nightfall, the Confederate troops had been driven back to their original positions. Grant began plans to resume his assault in the morning, although neglecting to close the escape route that Pillow had opened. John A. Logan was gravely injured on February the 15th, soon after the victory at Donelson. He was promoted to Brigadier General in the Volunteers. Nearly 1,000 soldiers on both sides had been killed, with about 3,000 wounded still on the field. Some froze to death in the snowstorm, many Union soldiers having thrown away their blankets and coats. And inexplicably, Generals Floyd and Pillow were upbeat about the day's performance, and wired General Johnston at Nashville that they had won a great victory. General Simon Bolivar Buckner, however, argued that they were in a desperate position and that it was getting worse with the arrival of the Union reinforcements. At their final council of war in the Dover Hotel at 1:30 a.m. on February the 16th, Buckner stated that if C.F. Smith attacked again, he could only hold for 30 minutes, and he estimated that the cost of defending the fort would be as high as 75% casualty rate. Buckner's position finally carried the meeting. Any large-scale escape would be difficult. Most of the river transports were currently transporting wounded men to Nashville and would not return in time to evacuate the command. Floyd, who believed it would be captured, he would be indicated for corruption during his service as Secretary of War in President James Buchanan's cabinet before the war, promptly turned over his command to Pillow, who feared northern reprisals. In turn, Pillow passed the command to Buckner, who agreed to remain behind and surrender the army. During the night, Pillow escaped by small boat across the Cumberland. Floyd left the next morning on the only steamer available, taking his 2 regiments of Virginia infantry. Disgusted at the show of cowardice, a furious Nathan Bedford Forrest announced, "I did not come here to surrender my command." He stormed out of the meeting and led about 700 of his cavalrymen on their escape from the fort. Forrest's horsemen rode toward Nashville through the shallow, icy waters of Lick Creek, encountering no enemy and confirming that many more could have escaped by the same route if Buckner had not posted guards to prevent any such attempts. On the morning of February the 16th, Buckner sent a note to Grant requesting a truce and asking for terms of surrender. The note first reached General Smith, who exclaimed, "No terms to the damned rebels." When the note reached Grant, Smith urged him to offer no terms. Buckner had hoped that Grant would offer generous terms because of their earlier friendship. To Buckner's dismay, Grant showed no mercy towards men rebelling against the federal government. Grant's brusque reply became one of the most famous quotes of the war, earning him the nickname of unconditional surrender. "Sir, yours of this date proposing armistice and appointment of commissioners to settle terms of capitulation is just received. No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works. I am, sir, very respectfully, yours, Ulysses S. Grant." Grant was not bluffing. Smith was now in a good position to move on the fort, having captured the outer lines of his fortifications, and was under orders to launch an attack. Grant believed his position allowed him to forego a planned siege and successfully stormed the fort. Buckner responded to Grant's demand. "Sir, the distribution of the forces under my command, incident to an unexpected change of commanders, and the overwhelming force under your command, compel me, notwithstanding the brilliant success of the Confederate arms yesterday, to accept the ungenerous and unchivalrous terms with which you propose." Grant, who was courteous to Buckner following the surrender, offered to loan him money to see him through his impending imprisonment, but Buckner declined. The surrender was a personal humiliation for Buckner and a strategic defeat for the Confederacy, which lost more than 12,000 men, 48 artillery pieces, much of their equipment, and control of the Cumberland River, which led to the evacuation of Nashville. This was the first of 3 Confederate armies that Grant would capture during the war. The second was John C. Pemberton's at the Siege of Vicksburg, and the third Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox. Buckner also turned over considerable military equipment and provisions, which Grant's troops badly needed. More than 7,000 Confederate prisoners of war were eventually transported from Fort Donelson to Camp Douglas in Chicago, Camp Morton in Indianapolis, and other prison camps elsewhere in the North. Buckner was held as a prisoner at Fort Warren in Boston until he was exchanged in August of 1862. The casualties at Fort Donelson were heavy, primarily because of the large Confederate surrender. Union losses were 2,691, which were 507 killed, 1,976 wounded, and 208 captured or missing. Confederates, 13,846, of which 327 were killed, 1,127 wounded, and 12,392 captured or missing. Cannons were fired and church bells rung through the North at the news. The Chicago Tribune wrote that Chicago reeled mad with joy. The capture of the forts Henry and Donelson were the first significant Union victories in the war, and opened 2 great rivers to invasion in the heartland of the South. Grant was promoted to Major General of Volunteers, second in seniority only to Henry W. Halleck in the West. After newspapers reported that Grant had won the battle with a cigar clamped in his teeth, he was inundated with cigars sent from his many admirers. Before that, he'd been only a light smoker, but after finding that he couldn't give them all away, took to smoking them, which probably contributed to his later death from throat cancer. Grant had written in his memoirs that if all Union troops in the West were unified under a single commander to capitalize on the victory at Fort Donelson, the fighting in Western theaters of the Civil War would have been closed quickly. Close to a third of all Albert Sidney Johnston's forces were now prisoners. Grant had captured more soldiers than all previous American generals combined, and Johnston was thereby deprived of more than 12,000 soldiers who might have provided a decisive advantage at the impending Battle of Shiloh in less than 2 months' time. The rest of Johnston's forces were 200 miles apart, between Nashville and Columbus. With Grant's army between them, Grant's forces also controlled nearby rivers and railroads. General Buell's army threatened Nashville, while John Pope's troops threatened Columbus. Johnston was evacuated in Nashville on February the 23rd. surrendering his important industrial center to the Union and making it the first Confederate state capital to fall. Columbus was evacuated on March the 2nd. Most of Tennessee fell under Union control, as did all of Kentucky, although both were subject to invasion and periodic Confederate raiding. If you found the information in this video helpful, then please feel free to give the video a thumbs up or consider subscribing to the channel. Again, I thank you for listening to this video, and I apologize for all my coughing. Thank you very much.